Hello students, welcome to your English literature class. Today in this video we'll be doing chapter number 6 of your Treasure Trove volume 2 short stories. So students, you need to open the book at page number 117. The name of the chapter is An Angel in Disguise. So after going through this video, you will be able to know about the gist, theme and summary of the story. So let us know something about the author. So An Angel in Disguise is a beautiful, heart-touching story written by American author Timothy Shea Arthur in 1851. The author has contributed greatly towards social and moral responsibilities required of people by writing a number of newspaper articles, poems, stories, and novels. Arthur wrote stories with compassion and sensitivity. So students, Angel in Disguise is a short story written in 1851 by an American author T.S. Arthur. So let us know and understand about the story. So An Angel in Disguise is a story which lays emphasis, underline emphasis and write down giving special importance or attention to something. Right? So An Angel in Disguise is a story which lays emphasis on the importance of loving and caring for others and proves that love is essential for human survival. So underline the word survival and write down continuing to live or exist. The story is about a poor woman who falls upon the threshold in a drunken fit and dies, leaving behind 2 daughters and a son to fend for themselves. Students, please underline the word threshold and write down the floor of an entrance to a building or a room of her own door. Here of her own door, but otherwise threshold is the entrance to a building or a room, right? So, and underline the word fit and write down sudden attack of uncontrolled movements. So, as the poor woman, she is in a drunken fit, so she actually falls upon the threshold of her door. And she left behind 2 daughters and a son to fend for themselves. Fend for themselves means to look after themselves. The townspeople take pity on these children and the 2 oldest are taken in by new families, but the youngest, Maggie, who is crippled, is left alone because no one wants to deal with her disability. Underline the word crippled and write down disabled. So Maggie, she is the protagonist of the story. She is not only an orphan but also a disabled girl. And since the elder 2 are good enough to do work, they are adopted. And as Maggie is a disabled child, no one adopts her. A man named Joe Thompson decides to take her in for the night, but plans on taking her to the poorhouse the next morning because he knows his wife would not approve of her. When Joe brings Maggie home in arms, his wife is enraged. Underline the word enraged and write down to make somebody very angry. And underline the word sick brat and write down an ill-mannered, annoying child. So his wife is enraged that he brings that sick brat into her house. So students, Mr. Joe Thompson is a kind-hearted man, and that is why he decides to take Maggie for the night at his house. And further, he decides to take her to the poorhouse. Students, poorhouse is a place for dependent or needy persons where they are taken care of. While on the other side, Mrs. J. Thompson is a vinegar-tempered lady, and Mr. Joe Thompson knows she will not approve of his bringing of Maggie at home. Joe begs her, "Look at her kindly, Jane. Speak to her kindly. Think of her dead mother and the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow that must be on all her coming life." So basically, Joe requests Jane to be kind and polite with her since she had suffered a great loss of her mother and was separated from her. The softness of his heart gives eloquence to his lips. Underline the word eloquence and write down the quality of delivering a clear, strong message. While Joe is out at work, his wife spends the day with Maggie and grows very fond of her. So students, as she spends the day with Maggie, she grows a liking for her. The Thompsons end up keeping Maggie and she becomes a blessing. It had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time just because his wife had nothing to love and care for out of herself and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered and self-afflicting in the desolation of her woman's nature. Please underline the word miserable and write down the meaning unhappy or uncomfortable. Underline the word self-afflicting and write down infliction of pain or suffering on oneself. So this sort of pain is self-created basically. So desolation, it means a state of complete emptiness or destruction. So students, from this we come to know that Mrs. Thompson is an ill-tempered lady because she did not have a child to love and care for, and that's why she does not like the idea of bringing Maggie at home and is very angry. So now the sweetness of that sick child looking ever to her in love, patience and gratitude was as honey to her soul, and she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. Maggie was an angel in disguise. Please underline the word gratitude and write down the meaning thankfulness. Sweetness of Maggie, her feeling of thankfulness to them brought a change in the attitude of Mrs. Jane Thompson towards Maggie. So, Maggie proves to be an angel in disguise as she brings happiness in the life of childless couple. So students, I hope you have understood the gist of the story. Now let us understand the theme of the story. So in this story, T.S. Arthur stresses the importance of loving and caring for others and goes on to prove that love is essential for human survival. Through this story, he points out the true meaning of compassion for kindness and love. Underline the word compassion and write down sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings. So basically here in this chapter, the author tries to convey the message of kindness, gratitude, caring, change and happiness. He conveys this idea through the story of a poor woman who falls upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit and dies, leaving behind 2 daughters and a son to fend for themselves. So students, as I told you earlier also, so this lady dies on the threshold of her own door and she left behind 2 daughters and a son to fend for themselves. The townspeople take pity on these children and the 2 oldest are taken in by 2 families. But the youngest, Maggie, who is crippled, is left alone because no one wants to deal with her disability. So students, since the elder 2 are good enough to do work, they are adopted. And as I told earlier, as Maggie is a disabled child, no one adopts her. A man named Joe Thompson decides to take her in for the night, but plans on taking her to the poor house the next morning. Because he knows his wife would not approve of her. When Joe brings Maggie home in arms, his wife is enraged that he brings that sick brat into her house. So Joe Thompson is a kind-hearted man. So he felt pity on Maggie and that's why he takes Maggie to his house for a day. Joe begs his wife to treat her kindly. He tells her to think of her dead mother and the loneliness the pain and the sorrow that must be on all her coming life. He refers to the Bible in which the Savior has taught his disciples to love children. While Joe is out at work, Mrs. Thompson spends the day with Maggie and develops compassion for her. Then she grows fond of her. Students, please underline the word Savior. Here refers to Jesus Christ, and disciples here refers to personal followers of Christ during his life. Please underline compassion and write down sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings. So students, from this we come to know that Mrs. Thompson is an ill-tempered lady and she does not like the idea of bringing Maggie at home. And she is very angry, but Joe Thompson tries to convince her by giving various examples from the Bible that how Jesus also had taught his disciples to love children. Now when Joe goes out for work, Jane spends a day with Maggie. She feels pity for her, and her pity soon changes into concern and she starts liking her. So the Thompson end up keeping Maggie and she becomes a blessing. It had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time. Miserable, please underline the word miserable and write down sad. So it had been dark and cold and miserable for a long time just because she here is Thompson's wife, had nothing to love and care for except herself, and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered, self-afflicting in the desolation. Please underline the word desolation and write down the meaning, a state of complete emptiness and destruction of her woman's nature. Now, the sweetness of that sick child looking ever to her in love, patience, and gratitude was as honey to her soul, and she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. Maggie was an angel in disguise. So as I already told you that Mrs. Jane Thompson had become ill-tempered woman and brought sorrow to herself because of having no one on whom she could shower her love. But sweetness of Maggie, her feeling of thankfulness to them, brought a change in the attitude of Mrs. Jane Thompson towards Maggie. So they thought that they are helping her by adopting her. However, Maggie turned out to be the one who took away the negativity from their lives and brought them happiness. So the writer wants to convey that not only does Maggie need the care of another to survive, but Mrs. Thompson also needs Maggie as someone to care and love for, to live a happy, purposeful life. This displays that humans cannot survive without other humans to give them purpose and direction. So the example of this statement is very well proved or very well given in this chapter, Angel in Disguise, where Maggie and the Thompsons need someone in their life to love and take care for. So students, I hope you have understood the theme. Now let us read the summary. Death of a poor woman. The story tells us about a poor woman who fell upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit and died, leaving 2 daughters and a son behind to fend for themselves. This woman had been despised, scoffed at, and angrily denounced by nearly every man, woman, and child in the village. But now people took pity on her. Students, first of all, underline the word despise and write down to regard with contempt or scorn. So this woman had been despised. She was regarded with contempt or scorn, hatefulness. Scoffed at, treated as ridiculous. So she was treated as ridiculous being. And angrily denounced, which means publicly declared to be wrong. So students, this woman was really hated by everyone. Why was she hated by everyone? Because she was a drunkard. Her habit of drinking too much takes away her life. Now, despite the hatred for the woman, everyone in the village pitied the children as there was nobody to take care of them. Neighbors went hastily, underline the word hastily and write down with excessive speed or urgency. Underline the word half-starving and write down very poorly fed or nourished. So neighbors went hastily to her hut with food for the half-starving, very poorly fed children, 3 in number. Of these, John, a boy of 12, was a stout lad. Stout, a healthy lad. Healthy boy. Kate, between 10 and 11, was a bright, active girl. But poor little Maggie, the youngest, was hopelessly diseased. And the old woman's death roused the neighbors' pity, and they arranged for her burial and brought food for her undernourished children, John, a healthy boy, Kate, an active girl, and Maggie, a crippled child. 2 years before, a fall from a window had injured her spine, and so she was bedridden. Underline the word bedridden and write down having to stay in bed because of illness or injury. Underline the word pitied and write down felt sorry for the misfortunes of. The townspeople pitied these children and the 2 oldest taken in by new families, but the youngest, Maggie, who was crippled, was left in a poor house. One of them said, "Take her to the poor house." But another said, "The poor house is a sad place for a sick and helpless child." So students, John and Kate were healthy enough to work. They were adopted, but Maggie was disabled, so the neighbors contemplated on sending her to the poor house. Though one of them expressed his concern that the poor house was not a good place for a poor child. Yet, after a lot of discussions, it was decided that Maggie should be sent to the poor house. It was a sad place, but for her it would be like a blessing where she could be taken care of, kept clean, given healthy food, etc. So Joe Thompson takes pity on Maggie. A man named Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, took pity on Maggie and decided to take her with him for the night, but planned to take her to the poor house the next morning because he knew his wife would not approve of her. So Joe Thompson is a person who makes or repairs the wooden wheels. Joe was a kind man and liked children. He lifted her in his strong arms and took her to his home. So this gesture of Joe Thompson proves that he was a kind-hearted man. And that is why he felt pity on Maggie. And he took Maggie to his house for a day. But on the other side, he knew that his wife, Jane Thompson, is not going to accept this. And that is why he thought he will be taking Maggie to the poor house the next day. Now, his wife, who was childless, was not a woman of saintly temper. Please underline the word saintly temper and write down temper in which a person behaves in a very simple or holy way. But his wife was not the same. So she was not a woman of saintly temper. She saw her husband approaching from the window. When Joe entered his home with Maggie in his arms, his wife was enraged and said, "You have brought home that sick brat?" So, as Mrs. Thompson was childless, she had turned bitter and unkind. On seeing her husband bring a diseased child home, she kept questioning him about why he did not drop her to the poor house directly. Underline the word astonishment and write down surprise. And underline the word pleading and write down requesting. So anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson, and her face was in flame. Joe did not reply except by a look that was pleading and cautionary. That said, "Wait a moment for explanation and be gentle." Joe explained to her that after her mother's funeral, everybody went away. She was left alone in her hut, so he brought her there. He told her that he would take her to the poorhouse the next day. She told him to go at once and leave her there. So students, anger and astonishment were in the tones of Mrs. Joe Thompson, and her face was really very angry. It was inflamed because she was really angry on the idea of bringing that disabled child Maggie at home. But Joe did not reply. He just gave a requesting look, which was cautionary. Because basically Joe was requesting Jane to be kind and polite with her, since she had suffered a great loss of her mother and was separated from her siblings. He just said that since she was left alone, nobody actually adopted her. That is why he had brought Maggie for a day only at their house and promised that he would be taking Maggie to the poorhouse next day. But Jane Thompson again was stubborn, and she stuck to the point that Maggie should be left to the poorhouse right then. Children need special care, Jane said Joe with an impressiveness of tone that greatly subdued his wife. Underline the word subdued and write down quiet and rather reflective. Please underline the word rebuked and write down express sharp disapproval. So Jane said Joe with an impressiveness of tone that greatly subdued his wife, I read in the Bible sometimes and find much said about little children, how the Savior rebuked the disciples who would not receive them, how he took them up in arms and blessed them, and how he said that whosoever gave them a cup of cold water should not go unrewarded. So he gave example from the Bible to convince her that those who help children were rewarded by God. Now, it is a small thing for us to keep this motherless little one for a single night, to be kind to her for a single night, to make her life comfortable for single night. The voice of the strong rough man shook, and he turned his head away so that the moisture in his eyes might not be seen. Basically, Joe requested Jane to be kind and polite with her, since she had suffered a great loss of her mother and was separated from her siblings. While saying these words, he got emotional and turned his head away from his wife so that she could not see the tears in his eyes. Mrs. Thompson did not answer, but a soft feeling crept into her heart. Underline the word crept and write down move slowly and carefully in order to avoid being heard or noticed. So a soft feeling crept into her heart. Look at her kindly, Jane. Speak to her kindly, said Joe. Think of her dead mother and the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow that must be on her coming life. The softness of his heart gave eloquence to his lips. So he is trying to convince Jane to be polite enough to the motherless child Maggie. A change in Joe's wife. While Joe was out at work, his wife spent the day with Maggie. When Joe returned, he saw Maggie lying a little raised on the pillow with the lamp shining full upon her face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the bed, talking to the child. He was happy to see a change in his wife's attitude. Joe was out at work. His wife, that is Mrs. Jane Thompson, spent a day with Maggie. And when Joe returned, he saw that Maggie was sitting in a raised position. She was lying actually on the raised pillow and with the lamp shining on her face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting beside her and she was talking to the child. They were in conversation. And thus Mr. Thompson was really very happy to see that change in his wife's attitude. As earlier, she was not at all willing to keep Maggie at their house. But now she was actually talking to Maggie. A deep drawn breath was followed by one of relief as a weight lifted itself from his heart. Joe entered the house but did not go immediately to the little chamber. His heavy tread about the kitchen brought his wife suddenly from the room where she had been with Maggie. Underline the word tread and write down walk in a specified way. So here, how was his walk? His walk was heavy. So basically, Joe Thompson was relieved on seeing Jane Thompson and Maggie in conversation. So Joe entered his house but did not really go to the chamber, did not go to the room because he didn't feel like going to the room and disturbing them. So his walk was really heavy, and listening to the sounds, Mrs. Jane Thompson actually reached at the kitchen. Joe thought it best not to refer to the child. How soon will supper be ready? He said. Right soon, answered Mrs. Thompson, with no roughness in her voice. After washing his hands and face, he went into the little bedroom where Maggie was lying. He looked at Maggie and saw that it had a lovely face. So Joe thought that it was best not to refer to the child or talk about child. So that was why he asked Mrs. Thompson about the supper. Your name is Maggie? He said as he sat down and took her soft little hands in his. Yes, sir. Her voice struck a chord that quivered in a low strain of music. Have you any pain? Said Joe. Sometimes, but not now, replied Maggie. So students, first of all, please underline quiver and write down tremble or shake with a slight rapid motion. So, he asked Maggie if she was feeling pain, and she replied that she feels pain sometimes but not now. And while she was speaking, yes sir, her voice struck a chord, like her voice was too low, which was actually trembling like a low strain of music. When a low stress of music is being played. So her voice was also like fading. So Mrs. Thompson takes care of Maggie. They continued conversing with each other. Then Mrs. Thompson came and said that supper was ready. Joe glanced from his wife's face to Maggie's. She understood him and said she can wait until we are done. Then I'll bring her something to eat. So first of all, please underline conversing and write down talking. Glanced, take a brief or hurried look. So while they both were conversing with each other, Mrs. Thompson came from the kitchen and she announced that the supper was ready. So Joe was looking towards his wife once and then Maggie's face, signaling her that he is worried about Maggie's supper. To which Mrs. Jane Thompson replied as she understood completely and said that Maggie can wait until they had finished their food, and after which she will bring something to eat for Maggie. After some time, she said, what are you going to do with that child? I thought you understood me that she was to go to the poorhouse, replied Joe. So, Mrs. Jane Thompson asked Joe Thompson that what is he going to do with that child? To which Mr. Thompson replied that he thought that she might be knowing that what was to be done with that child. Mrs. Thompson gave food to Maggie and asked her if it was good. The child answered with a look of gratitude that awoke to new life old feelings which had been slumbering in her heart for half a score of years. We'll keep her a day or two longer. She's so weak and helpless, said Mrs. Joe Thompson. So, please underline the word slumbering and write down sleeping. So here what happened is, like Mrs. Thompson first of all gave food to Maggie and asked her if it was really good, if it tasted good. And Maggie was so much in gratitude that she replied her sweetness gave honey to her soul, and the old feelings which were there sleeping inside Mrs. Jane Thompson, the thankfulness of Maggie aroused that sleeping feeling in her, which brought the change in Jane Thompson's heart. So that is why she just said that they should keep Maggie a day or two longer as she is so helpless and weak. Maggie, a blessing. Mrs. Thompson grew very fond of Maggie. The Thompsons ended up keeping Maggie and she became a blessing. It had been dark and cold and miserable there for a long time just because his wife had nothing to love and care for out of herself, and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered, and self-afflicting in the desolation of her woman's nature. Now the sweetness of that sick child, looking ever to her in love, patience, and gratitude, was as honey to her soul, and she carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. Maggie was an angel in disguise. So they've never sent Maggie away. She had become a part of their house and was taken care of as their own child. She became an angel in disguise for the childless Thompsons. She brought back the happiness and fulfillment. Now they had someone to shower their love, care, and affection on. Joe Thompson was happy as his house was no more a dull and a sad place. Students, I hope you have understood the summary of this chapter very well. Now, your homework for today is to revise theme and summary of the chapter An Angel in Disguise. Thank you.